My goal with it
Cool.
is I want to give. We all set?
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any questions? How do we want to do this?
Yes.
So,
Can you say your name and spell it?
my name is Christian Del Olmo, CHRISTIANDEL space OLM. And I'm making a tabletop game, and I'm calling it Lowdown.
Where'd you get the name from?
It just has a certain vibe to it, and sometimes that's what you want, is a certain vibe. One of the inspirations for the game is Earthbound. It's 2 words, kind of punchy, right? It kind of sticks in your head, right? It's easy to say, it's iconic. So I was like, all right, I want something similar, with a similar feel. And the game that I'm making is largely based on the US, right? In our kind of culture and the world that we live in. So Lowdown felt appropriate, it gives sort of a partially a Western vibe, but also makes it feel like it's a little dirty, like it not all is good in this land.
So that's how the name translates to the setting. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the setting?
It's sort of a magical realist version of the US. So the goal with the game is more or less to give an alternative to D&D. Not as a D&D killer, but just I'm sick of fantasy. I'm sick of elves, I'm sick of peasants and nobles and all of that stuff. Because at the end of the day, I can't relate to a serf. And the fun in trying to do so has kind of run its course. And on top of that, I think D&D has a very specific way of going about its rules, which is largely, maybe not fully crunchy, but a little heavier on the rules, and lately I've kind of begun to enjoy more rules-like games. And so my goal is really to bridge the gap. I want there to be enough mechanics there that it feels fun, you can create builds and kind of explore the mechanics of it, but I also want it to be rules light enough that the story is the priority, the role play is the priority, and the rules exist in order to tell a better story. And I think, again, going back to a world that I can relate to, the US, it's where I live, We have this rich history and mythology, a very particular kind of culture, a very particular climate, and I think that setting games in that kind of world opens up a lot of possibility for storytelling. You don't need to play a knight, in 50 pounds of armor to be cool. Maybe your character works at a gas station and they have a dead-end job and they're not happy and they have all these struggles, and when the opportunity presents itself and something weird happens, they're the ones that get to step up and be the hero for a day. I think that having characters be more mundane makes the heroics even more exciting because they earned it. And that's important, that feel is important.
What about the magical sense? You said the mundane. What brings the magical to this world in your setting?
The United States is kind of haunted in a way. I mean, for one, we have a very rich history of ghost stories, cryptids, UFOs, This country more or less is the origin of aliens and UFOs as we know them. And so we have a lot to pull from there. Even just getting on the highway and driving from one place to another elicits a certain kind of feeling. There's stories that people make about this, right? The left-right game is one, and there's a couple others that are just sort of focused on that feeling of the haunted America, and as well, mechanically, there are magic classes. There's abilities that give you, magic abilities and let you replicate sort of existing known fantasy archetypes, but through a different lens, right? I have a class that I call the Conduit, and this would be equivalent to maybe like a sorcerer or an evocation wizard, but it's a lot more stripped down in a sense, right? Because there's no set list of spells. You know, you have things that you can do, ways that you can use your magic and sort of evoke the powers that you have. But you have a lot of freedom in that sense, right? Because it's so simplified, you get to choose yourself how you make it different and unique. Maybe you do want to go with like a more classic kind of arcane wizard feel. Maybe you want them to be a superhero. The jobs, which are what I call the classes, they're all designed in a way that you kind of build out, bits and pieces from different jobs that you want. So you can kind of create your own, almost create your own class. And yeah, I think that giving people the opportunity to explore the supernatural, just like the mundane enhances the supernatural, I think the supernatural enhances the mundane. Magical realism as a genre is kind of built on that idea that life is never going to purely be, devoid of that kind of magic. It's sort of omnipresent in our lives as human beings.
So the classes or the jobs, what are they like and how are they classified?
So I have the jobs split into 3 kind of broad categories. So you have the muscle, which is the more, sort of physical focused jobs. This is where a lot of the combat focused jobs fit, but not exclusively. Anything that sort of relies on using your body fits into this category. You've got the mystics, right? And this is where the magic focused classes fit in. That being said, the way I see it, some of the mystic classes don't even necessarily have to be magic with the way that you play them. If you want to just use the abilities and sort of have that just be something that your character can do, that's fine. I don't think I necessarily want there to be a distinction between magic and non-magic in the same way that D&D has like anti-magic, because it's all meant to kind of blur together in a sense. And finally, there's the specialist classes, and these are the more sort of specialist jobs, right? It's things like, sort of like an investigator type of thing, or I even have like a host themed job, which would be more of your customer service, or even just a nice grandma that wants to cook you a meal. They all fill a different role, but with the way that you build out your character, you're sort of just taking experience that you earn throughout the game and then buying abilities from the various jobs. And I think this allows for a lot of flexibility, but it still preserves what I like about a class system, which is it gives you sort of pre-made archetypes that you can dive into. Things that you can sort of tailor to fit a certain role and a certain narrative. And, I think the ability to sort of mix and match only enhances that.
Where do you think the fun and enjoyment comes from setting or play style like this? Where do you derive that the player's going to have the most amount of fun?
I want the game to be punchy. For me, in trying to make the game fun, a big goal of mine has been making sure that the mechanics feel like what they're supposed to represent. Even more so than game balance, game feel has been like a core design motivator for me. I think the game is sort of low power in a sense, right? Your characters are not super powerful and super capable. They have a lot of limits, and I think a lot of the fun will come from overcoming those limits. For example, in combat, the combat's a lot punchier, right? I have a system where you're rolling dice over a certain damage threshold, and every time you overcome it, a character takes a wound. You can only take so many. And if you go over the amount of wounds that you take, they start getting worse, and the game has sort of a death spiral built into it. But to me, that's part of the fun, because it means that when you enter combat, you have to be careful. It has to be a choice, you know? When you hit someone, it packs a punch. And when you get hit, it packs a punch. You carry those consequences with you. And, you know, that allows for the more combat-focused classes to sort of excel in that field, right? Because combat is so brutal inherently, you know, having a job where maybe, you know, you can ignore having a certain number of wounds, right? Maybe they don't negatively impact you in a way. I think that makes them feel like what they're supposed to be, which is like a brawler. You know, they're scrappy, they can dish it and they can take it. You know, I think as long as characters have the right tools, they're gonna find ways to overcome your challenges. But, you know, I want it to be a struggle along the way, and a rewarding one at that.
So you brought up combat. I mean, what do you think the major draw to your game for combat would be? Like, what kind of system did you put in place?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, without trying to like over-explain how the dice system works and how health works and all of that stuff, you know, I'm trying to design it to be quick and punchy. That's really the goal. You know, everybody on your team goes at the same time, everybody on the enemy team goes at the same time. And the point of that is that you can sort of collaborate in your actions, right? There's a set initiative order. It does require, I think, a little bit more restraint and respect from the party, but you know, if you can't maintain that, maybe this isn't the right hobby. You know, that should be just an assumed thing. And so kind of the goal with it is, it's like, okay, you get in, a couple big hits are thrown, and then it resolves itself relatively quickly. You know, and I'm sort of writing it into the rules that death is sort of an extreme consequence, right? If the game does take place in a contemporary setting, killing people is illegal. Even if you do it in self-defense, there's a whole process that will bog you down. So you don't really want to get killed, and you don't really want to kill other people, and, you know, realistically, they're probably trying to avoid the same thing. You know, unless they're really crazy or ballsy, or they know they can get away with it. So, you know, I think being able to explore consequence is also a fun one, because it's like, okay, well, you guys lost the fight, they're just gonna rob you. They're gonna take your stuff, and that sucks. It's a setback, you know, you have to crawl away and lick your wounds, and you have to deal with the fact that you have less than you started with. But I think it also creates the opportunity for a really exciting character moment when you can sort of get back to where you were, even, you know, become stronger than you used to be, and then take back what was yours. You know, you get revenge, you reclaim your reputation, and, you know, I think that is almost more exciting and rewarding than just, you know, winning the first time. And, you know, even more so, I think if a character does die, it has a lot more weight to it. There's a lot more consequence. I sort of built into the game. The funny thing is, I'm gonna bring out the character sheet and sort of show what the thought process was. There's 3 sort of core stats, right? Mind, body, and soul. And they all have sort of a list of skills. So 4 for mind, 3 for body, 2 for soul. And because soul only had 2, there's this little space underneath. And I was thinking, what am I gonna do to fill that? So I just drew in a little box. I'm like, I'll put like a meter or something in here. And so I ended up going with a tether system. So there's a little graphic there. It's just a little person floating out into space with a tether attaching them to the earth. And you know, it was sort of a spur of the moment thing, but I was like, it would be interesting if there's a system where, unless you're killed outright, you know, if you're like dying and no one's there to save you, you can just mark off one of your tethers. You kind of like slash it through, you know, and you get 3. Only 3. You know, if someone's running this game, they can choose to do otherwise, but rules as intended, every time you mark out a tether, that's it. And once you go through all 3, you know, that's it. You know, your character, they have one last chance, you know. that you get 3 near-death experiences where you come back from the brink or you pull through, whatever it may be. But after that, your character just has to survive until they can't anymore. You know, I think consequence is really important to this kind of game. You know, it's not like a video game where everything is pre-programmed. You have to sort of maintain the rules, you know, and consequence is what keeps it from just being a game of pretend, which it is a game of pretend, but it's a game of pretend with enough rules that it's fun and exciting. So, you know, that's sort of a big thing for me.
The 3 different core stats.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not to like over-explain or anything, but I would love for you to give a brief explanation of them and how you think that would fit into either combat or roleplay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, with the core stats, the way that I'm kind of doing my die system is that each of the 3 stats has a number associated with it, 1 through 4, and every skill, as well as, you know, weapons, tools, certain things like that, might have a die associated with them. So, you know, they sort of work together, right? So if you have a mind skill of 2 and your focus is a D6, every time you make a focus check, you roll 2d6. And I feel like this is a very unique system. I haven't seen anything like it, you know, because dice pools are pretty common, as well as, you know, sort of increasing proficiency through other means. But I think combining them like this is very unique, and this goes back to game feel, you know. I want there to be 2 approaches to getting better at something. You can increase your core stat, you know, and your overall capability gets better. You know, you're rolling more dice, you have more sort of competency baseline, but increasing the actual skill means that every single die has a higher chance of rolling a better number. You know, and I want to keep it small, right? So like I said, for the core stats, 1 through 4, I don't intend for you to have more than a 4 because I want it to be simple. With the skills, you know, the D6 is what I'm going to have as baseline, but during character creation, you turn 2 of your skills into D8s and 2 of them into D4s, right? There's 2 things you're bad at and 2 things you're good at. You're okay at the rest. But even then, like, I don't think I want players to be able to go past D10s, you know, with their skills, unless they're like using a special ability, right? They're going beyond natural limits. I think a D10 is a reasonable place to cut it off. You know, there's 4 die that you can sort of cycle through depending on how good you are at something. And there's already quite a bit of variance in that, you know. To me, that's also fun because it means that you can save D8s and D20s for, you know, bigger things, right? If you're fighting, you know, maybe a monster of some kind, right? If you find a way to fit one into your setting, maybe it's a Sasquatch, right? A big ape thing, you know, and it rolls D12s or D20 for its you know, physical checks, right? That thing's strong. It's really strong, you know. You get the sense that, okay, maybe we can't just outmuscle it, we have to find another way. You know, and I think that because there's such a wide range, I don't want DCs to be completely set in stone, you know, because it's like with D&D, you have a DC, and if you roll above it, you succeed. If you roll below, you fail. I want there to be a range, right? So if you roll below it within, say, 5, right? If the DC is a 15, and you roll an 11, maybe you still succeed, but there's sort of a consequence, you know, something extra that you have to deal with to overcome it, you know. On the opposite side, if you rolled a 20, right, you rolled really high, I think you should get extra benefits from that, you know. And in that sense, that way, the amount that you roll isn't just a flat sort of yes or no, do you succeed? It sort of plays into the narrative, right? It enhances the narrative and guides how the DM and the player can sort of tell their story.
For DMs, what do you think is the major draw to a system like this?
Again, ideally the feel of it, you know. I think being in a modern world gives people a lot of options for telling stories that maybe aren't accessible within fantasy or even sci-fi, you know? Because those worlds are so different from ours that, you know, to some extent they're never gonna fully be relatable. You can tell stories using similar themes, you know, or things like that, but there's aspects of it that are gonna be alien to us always. You know, on the DM side of things, I have ideas. I have a whole concept that I need to flesh out on, you know, it's more or less two things, but scenes and sort of antagonistic forces, right? So I want the DM to be a player in their own, you know, sort of way, right? And these systems are not really fleshed out. They're concepts, and I have sort of things that I want them to be, but they aren't fully there yet. So like with the scenes, you know, I like the idea that there's almost conditions to a scene, you know? And this kind of came about from the idea that a DM can, you know, look at the players and go, things just went from bad to worse. You know, these are like conditions with their own rules that come with them, and players know, okay, when things go from bad to worse, we have to worry or we have to focus, you know, something happened, and you can tie player mechanics into that. So for example, I have a job called the Rascal. It's a specialist, and it's sort of meant to fulfill the, you know, partially the roguish fantasy. You know, this is someone that gets into trouble, you know, they lie, steal, they lie, cheat, and steal, you know. They gamble, they drink, they sort of act like happy-go-lucky degenerates, you know. And I liked the idea that for the Rascal, when things go from bad to worse, you get some kind of benefit, you know. This is where you thrive. You're good at handling these kinds of situations, you know. You get yourself into them, and then you get yourself out of them, and that's rewarding. But again, there's not a lot there yet. Same goes for, I have a system in mind for sort of antagonistic forces, you know. I like the idea that the DM can almost choose a class in their own regard by playing sort of, you know, maybe they're playing as like an eldritch being or some kind of organization, you know, and they have a list of things where this is when you're able to see what the players are doing, you know, this is how you're able to interact with them. Maybe they build up some kind of points and they can spend them to do things to interfere with the players, you know, a little more consequence-free, you know, than just changing the scene, you know, because DMs have a lot of fiat. You can basically do whatever you want, but you have to sort of keep it reasonable. And I like the idea of using mechanics to do things that initially might not seem reasonable, you know? So like with the idea of playing maybe some kind of eldritch being, you know, when can you see the players? Always. That's the draw. You always know what they're doing. You always know where they are. But maybe you have less sway because it's, you know, it's the physical world. You have to act through secondary means. Or maybe you're playing as some kind of shadowy organization. Maybe it's a government organization or a cult or something similar. They don't always know what the players are doing, but they have ways to figure it out. You know, maybe they have someone spying on the players. Maybe they hack into their, you know, technology and spy on them, listen in on their phone calls. This creates, I think, a tension where the players have to sort of act accordingly. You know, they have an antagonistic force working in opposition to them, you know, and maybe the DM can, you know, as time goes on, take certain moves. So it's like, you know, the players leave and they come back and it's like, it seems like your car was broken into, you know. There's a consequence that can come with that the DM can apply. So it almost is like the DM is playing a character in a sense. You know, again, I need to work on this more, but I think the concept there is really interesting, and I think that I could do something fun with it if I give it enough time to cook, you know.